to Random History Talk. So today we'll be continuing reading from The Battle for China, Essays on the Military History of the Sino-Japanese War of 1937 to 1945. So I read a little bit by myself, maybe 1 or 2 pages, so nothing crazy. We'll go off from there. So I have a physical copy of the book and also an electronic version, so I can share screen and read on here. Let's see, probably around here. With 2020 hindsight, one can see that the latest round of Japanese bullying of China also potentially provided Chiang's Kuomintang regime with a symbol for ratifying Chinese public support. Ominously, more of the Japanese pacification of Manchuria and the end of fighting in Shanghai did not extinguish the flashpoints of Sino-Japanese hostility. So previously I left off a part from the recording that I read a little bit on my own, where Japan and China had a skirmish in Shanghai, and it's not a small scale skirmish either, because as you can see, entire army divisions were involved from Japanese. And if you know a little bit about how divisions are organized, these are maybe 10,000 men, but also of course it depends on each country. The organization is different, but a division is probably at least 10,000 men. So I had a skirmish with lots of people there. In the fall of 1932, several of these burst into flame. Skirmishes took place at Shanhaiguan, an historic Chinese coastal town at the eastern terminus of the Great Wall, where under the terms of the Boxer Protocol, the Japanese maintained a small garrison. There a series of clashes broke out between the garrison and the forces of a local Chinese warlord. The first 2 clashes were settled locally and peacefully, but the third on New Year's Day, 1933, and apparently instigated by a Japanese garrison commander. So you see this a lot, this instigation, fighting around the border, hesitating from the actual possibility of a war, but always trying to cause some trouble, led to fierce fighting and eventually drew in the Japanese infantry division and significant Japanese naval forces. Okay, so you see Japanese Navy is also involved. It's no longer just some army officials saying, hey, let's just piss off the Chinese a little bit. That's escalated. You also see the involvement again of an entire division. It's not just some regiments trying to screw around. Under such pressure, the Chinese withdrew south of the Great Wall and the Japanese took possession of the south gate of Shanhaiguan. China protested the affair to the League of Nations, but failed to convince the powers to intervene, and thus the crisis ended. But not before Japan had added this humiliation to the growing list of injuries inflicted on China. So the League of Nations, as you know, is suggested initially by Woodrow Wilson, the president for the United States. So he was kind of a mediator sort of figure between the Central Powers and the Entente. Which is, the Entente is Britain, France, initially Russia, but they had a revolution there, and Italy, and the Central Powers of Germany, Austria-Hungary, Ottoman Empire, so on. So America joined the war very late, so they sort of acted as a mediating figure because they didn't have many stakes in Europe. So they tried to form this neutral sort of organization where all the nations could come together and resolve issues in the world together. That's the ideal. Of course, Woodrow Wilson is a very controversial figure. He's very problematic policies. But that aside, the League of Nations goes down as America goes down, because the initial backers, the Americans, they didn't even join it. So that doesn't give it much prestige. When people who proposed it didn't even want to join it, because of Congress. But also, it doesn't really have much strength behind it. It's even weaker than the United Nations today. So it doesn't have much influence over Japan. plus Japan's breaking away from the international order, so they don't really care. Ignoring the danger of possible escalation, the Japanese army insisted that the security of Manchuria, now described as Japan's lifeline, required the creation of a buffer zone to the southwest of Manchuria to deflect assertive and irredentist Chinese nationalism. See, this also aligns with the earlier facts about turmoils amongst warlords and potential political refugees, dissidents, nationalist elements rising up and going to Manchuria, right? This is what exactly Japan wanted to prevent because it causes instability in the region, in turn resulting in an unstable Manchuria. Well, that's a plausible excuse anyways. Furthermore, Manchuria was not the treasure house the staffs of Guangdong and Tianjin garrison armies expected. So I think, I'm not 100% sure. Let me, if I can find a map for you. Hold on a second. So I believe if you zoom out, so I think the Tianjin garrison is here, and the Guangdong army, as we shared last time, is around this area in Shandong. So there are two separate portions of the Japanese Imperial Army. The Tianjin garrison up here near the city of Tianjin are probably incorporated together with the Manchurian Japanese forces, while the Qingdao garrison, the ones in Shandong, are more associated probably with the closer at least with the Japanese Navy, because they require naval support to be able to supply themselves in such an enclave, whereas the Tianjin garrison is directly connected to the Manchurian forces up north, and their supply line can directly comes through Japanese-controlled Manchuria as well as Japanese-controlled Korea. You can just sail by sea into South Korea, supply all the way through here, through the Manchurian Railway and through Korea. That's a plausible route. So yeah, as the officers began to covet the resources of North China, its coal and iron in particular, to make up the difference. Assessing the chances for the success of another incursion, these officers rationalized that North China is still a collection of contending warlord fiefdoms and thus vulnerable to Japanese intimidation, subversion, and bribery. Notice this still. I mean, it might be about to change, so they have to do it right now. They are scared that it will become united and problematic. Misguided assumptions about territorial security, material ambition, and political opportunism all combined to impel Japan forward into North China and Inner Mongolia after the conquest of Manchuria, heedless of any Chinese response. As in the case of Manchuria, the basic objective was the creation of a Japanese-dominated buffer zone from which nationalist influence was to be driven out. The basic strategy would be to instigate and then work behind movements for regional autonomy, a process supplemented by the activities of the Army's notorious special service organs, agitation, subversion, and constant political warfare to further fragment Chinese authority of the region. So this is an interesting strategy. They don't want to declare war or risk anything risky like that, even border skirmishes. What they want to accomplish is to soften up the region and basically make it some sort of puppet or border area where it's safe. And it protects the Japanese core in Manchuria. This is kind of similar to the strategy that the British had with South Carolina being a sort of protective border zone against the Native Americans in the Spanish in Florida, so that colonies like North Carolina, etc., can be safe. Or I think it was Georgia was actually the safety zone, and South Carolina was the sort of the profitable zone. I could be mistaken. The first of Japan's fatal steps to move beyond Manchuria's western borders was the decision of the Guangdong army to round out its possession of Manchuria by occupying the neighboring Zhekou province. The prospect of this new Japanese incursion had been widely rumored in China on the eve of the Japanese attack. Also, let me just search up where the Zhekou province is, just to not have any confusion. Yeah, so you can see like right here where it is. Of course, you see like Manchuria is this area in Zhekou province, or Rehe is right here. from what I can tell, it seems to um, at least contain or border Beijing, the traditional capital of Qing dynasty and Ming and so on. Actually, I think those were the only two. Um, so essentially, they said measure is not enough for going in. Zhang Xueliang, in command of the largest Chinese forces in Zhehe, had sought Chiang Kai-shek's commitment of Central Army units in repelling the imminent Japanese assault. So as you know, like between those Chinese warlords, by the 1930s, there's a somewhat agreed upon status of Chiang Kai-shek as the central leader. He has the most elite and well-trained forces, but doesn't have total control of the regional warlords. They all pledge loyalty to him, but have their own machinations and local authority going on. So they don't want to risk anything if Cheng is not going to risk anything. So they want Cheng's guarantee that he will also commit. Otherwise, Zhang Xueliang is not going to fight. But Jiang, or Cheng in this pronunciation, in the midst of an anti-communist campaign in Jiangxi, had demurred, limiting his support to the public rhetoric of resistance. So remember, China's also fighting a civil war. They're trying to crush the communists. So they are having issues diverting these elite units. Zhang himself committed only his weakest troops to the defense of Zhehe because, well, if Jiang is not going to do anything, Zhang obviously don't want to risk his forces. Because if he loses units against the Japanese, that makes him weaker against Cheng, against the central Chinese government. The result was another Chinese disaster when two Japanese divisions, so 20,000 men, presumably, invaded the province in February 1933 and routed Zhang's units, which fled in panic and disorder. So, like 20,000 is not a lot at a national level. Completely losing an entire province in such a manner is really embarrassing. Which fled in panic and disorder. That's not good. The Japanese conquest of Zhehe appeared to leave Peking and Tianjin open to the Japanese assault, and in so doing created a firestorm of popular protests against Cheng's policy of pacification first and resistance. Well, if your troops are fleeing from the field and you lose an entire province, and you don't have the trust of your generals, you're not in a good situation. Yet, Cheng felt Jiang, or Jiang. Cheng is the romanization of the Chinese word, but Jiang is the pinyin pronunciation. So these two are two different ways of expressing English words in Chinese. Chinese words in English, or what's it called? Roman letters. Held firm to his course in the face of maneuvering by his rivals and fierce criticism from the public. So, these are problematic things happening inside China, so they're not in a position to really resist the Japanese. So, the front is he's attacking the communists, but at the same time, he might also know that it's not possible to resist Japan in the moment. It's best to just let the conflict die down instead of escalating it into a war, which China would definitely lose. So there's also that. Although Chiang Kai-shek may have held to his policy of dealing with his domestic enemies first, the appetite of the Kuomintang army extremists for further gains in North China was unabated. So you see these military extremists keep pushing. They are beyond the control of the Tokyo government at this point. The result was a series of sharp battles along the Great Wall as Kuomintang army units sought to seize and hold certain passes critical to the Chinese defense. In this fighting, the intermittent efforts of moderates at Tokyo headquarters were sporadically more effective in restraining the belligerent operations of the Japanese field army than the fierce but poorly coordinated resistance of Chinese regional and central army units. So this is a funny comment, because really neither the Tokyo headquarters nor the Chinese resistance could stop the Japanese effort, but somehow the government was slightly more effective than their enemy. So that's not great. It's not a great sign. As part of an emergent pattern in the Japanese army strategy in China, The Army Special Service Branch in Tianjin attempted to support the Kuomintang Army's ground operations by efforts to provoke popular unrest in Hebei against the Nanjing regime, but without great success. Interesting. So as you see, like these are two separate operations. The Tianjin Army and the Kuomintang Army are not exactly, they are separate components operating jointly, but they don't have to be. Then in May 1933, the Kuomintang Army broke through Chinese defenses on a broad front, spilling over the Great Wall at various points, once more threatened Peking and Tianjin. So what, it's been how many months? So the initial attack started in February, I guess. And then a slight escalation on the Great Wall, and in May, they have already broken the Great Wall, basically. Chiang Kai-shek, faced with the military debacle and becoming aware of a looming political crisis, sought a truce that would stave off both outcomes. He appointed subordinates to try and carry out the negotiations in order to make it appear that any agreement with the Japanese invader would be local and temporary. For their part, officers of the Kuomintang Army who were once more acting on their own, or at least in advance of Tokyo headquarters, carried out the negotiations, not Japanese consular representatives in China. So this is how extreme the situation has gotten, where officers of a nation are representing the nation on behalf of, well, the entire diplomatic power of the country. Like, the government is not in charge anymore. If you are a random person, a random general, like attending diplomatic meetings and representing this country with full force, that's a sign that military is the country at this point. The subsequent Tangu Truce of May 1933 was in every important way a major humiliation for China, in that it created a 5,000 square mile demilitarized zone over a large portion of Hebei province south of the Great Wall, from which national military units were to be immediately excluded. So, of course, the so-called buffer zone, I guess you can say demilitarized zone, is typical tactic where two sides agree to leave the area, but really the Chinese are losing because this is Chinese territory and the Chinese are leaving the area. But maybe it would be also good to see what this is about, like see the actual extent of the territorial exclusion on the map. Get some information. So you can see, I think what happened here is you have this gray area. It's quite big. So see, here is Zhihou, the Manchu called the Japanese puppet state, and Beiping, which is the old imperial city. So it's pretty much been immediately exposed to Japanese. Quite a large extent of Japanese occupation, also close to Tianjin as well, where the Japanese army is also garrisoned. Or that could just be a name, I'm actually not sure. Maybe they're just near that area. Under agreement, Japanese forces will be voluntarily withdrawn to the Great Wall on a timetable of their own choosing. Well, they don't really have to, because no one's going to make them. The Tangu Truce marked the first surge of Japanese military power into North China. It also opened the way for massive Japanese political and economic inroads into the region. Worse, the Japanese penetration of the Hebei province followed and confirmed the divide and rule strategy that the Japanese had pursued in Manchuria. The separation of large areas of Chinese territory from nationalist control by fostering puppet regimes in the territory obedient to Japanese dictates. It can be argued, of course, that Chiang Kai-shek has staved off worse disaster. Yeah, so that might be his thinking also. De-escalate the situation, let the Japanese win a little, and let everyone forget about it and secretly build up strength. Or that he was in a really weak political position internally and he couldn't afford a conflict where he would lose. Peking and Tianjin had not fallen. The negotiations had been localized. Chiang Kai-shek's name had been kept, or Jiang Jieshi, as you know, had been kept clear of the agreement, and its most sensitive terms had been kept secret. Most important to Chiang's policy of dealing first with his internal enemies, then with the external aggressor. The temporary cessation of combat in North China allowed him to turn back to his extermination efforts against the communists. So as you know, he wants to eliminate internal threats before dealing with the Japanese. That's his policy at all costs. But the damage to his cause was profound, and the precedent established was ominous. So you see a lot of nationalist sentiments foster beneath this huge failure, huge loss of national territory, and a humiliating treaty where your troops are no longer allowed to be stationed in mass areas in your own country. And an enemy has dictated when they will leave your country, or if at all. So that's extremely humiliating. But in the present situation, some might argue that his decision was necessary. Japanese aggression and Nanjing's defensive strategy. So 1933 to 1937, we're coming up to the war. The war starts in 1937. So we're about to see a lot more of intense operations. The narrative of Sino-Japanese relations from the Tangu Truce of 1933 through the spring of 1937 is dominated on the one hand by the efforts of Japan's field armies to detach North China from nationalist control through violence, agitation of anti-KMT unrest. KMT is Chiang Kai-shek's party, or dominant ruling party in China, and subversion. Yet, on the other hand, it's marked by Chiang Kai-shek's endeavors to keep the Japanese field armies at bay through compromise, delay, and defensive operations, while he directed the energies and forces of his nationalist government in a series of campaigns against the communist enclaves within China's borders. So he's buying time to unite China in order to fend off the Japanese, but it's not going extremely well, because Japanese are encroaching at a quite rapid rate. Throughout these 4 years, the Japanese Foreign Ministry played an ambiguous role. Intermittently, Japanese diplomats tried to step in and to settle differences between the two countries through talks with nationalist representatives in Nanjing. So, of course, they recognized the government in Nanjing and directly tried to negotiate it as a power broker in hopes that they can gain something, raising hopes in both capitals. When they did so, that lasting Sino-Japanese rapprochement may be possible. Of course, even though they're establishing puppets in North China, they still hope to maintain good relations with nationalist China, if somewhat in a manipulating way, where they are ruling the policies in China but still maintaining on surface level good relations. But the Japanese field armies, at once impatient with the pace of such negotiations and alarmed they would result in a strengthening of national authority in the very provinces they were trying to detach, repeatedly blocked the prospects of the real settlement. So here's what's different when you see things from a Tokyo perspective or from a field army perspective. From a Tokyo perspective, the objective of the army has been reached. We are infiltrating into these territories now to stabilize those gains, right? We have to negotiate with the nationalist armies, the nationalist government, to stabilize our gains. If they recognize our gains and they're helping us to achieve it, then we should try and be conservative and talk it out with them and actually realize those gains, actually realize the control of those territories. But the military, all they see is, well, we just defeated them on the field and they fled. So why are we negotiating with them? And why are we relinquishing control of these territories to some extent? Why are we even discussing terms, right? So they are seeing things from separate perspectives. From a Tokyo point of view, having huge field armies trying to garrison those provinces is a huge expense, which Japan cannot afford with this economic downturn. The field army does not see things that way. At other times, the foreign ministry seemed to fall in step with the design of the Japanese military, tendency notably epitomized by the infamous Amo Statement of 1934, which attempted to set forth the Japanese Monroe Doctrine, arrogating Asian affairs to Japan and warning Western nations that Japan will not tolerate any Western material or moral support from the Nanjing regime. So, as you might know, the Monroe Doctrine is a doctrine the United States President Monroe, I think it was around 1812 or 1820, that he declared the American continent, North American and South American continents, to be entirely outside the influence of European affairs or European empires, and he basically said that they cannot interfere in these policies of South and North American independent republics or nations. This is a similar attempt, basically establishing a sphere of influence and saying you can't touch it. Alarmed that negotiations with you see, this is a real break from the international community. Japan's no longer a part of it, like post 1918, when Japan had won World War I on the side of the Entente and actively participated in the removal of German colonies in Qingdao and also some islands in the Southeast Asia. So you see that Japan's no longer siding with the British or the French. They're really saying, well, don't bother us. We're going to build our own empire and we won't rely on you. Alarmed that negotiations with the nationalists would strengthen Nanjing's authority in North China, the Kuomintang army provoked a number of violent incidents in Hebei and Char province. This is getting old, right? This is pretty much all they do. Provinces in late 1934 and early 1935 designed to embarrass both Nanjing and Tokyo. So really, they want to escalate a fight. I mean, if they embarrass Nanjing enough, the national sentiment will cause the Chinese government to be forced to declare war. The same with Tokyo. If China escalates the situation, then Japan has to follow up. Otherwise, it will be at a disadvantage. For its part, the Nanjing government in dealing with these events was hampered by the virulently anti-Cheng faction in Guangzhou, which continued to snipe at Cheng's effort to find an accord with Japan. Cheng, distracted by his efforts to crush the communist forces retreating on what became famous Long March in June 1935, authorized his Minister of War General He Yingqin to enter into negotiations with the commander of the Tianjin garrison, Lieutenant General Umezu Yoshijiro. So the Long March, the communists have successfully escaped from their territory, losing about 90% of men, and basically all of their weapons and heavy material, but they have preserved their ideology and the core of their army. So Cheng is still trying to fight them, trying to finish this job, trying to finish the attack, but they don't really want to provoke the Japanese, even though the Japanese are clearly provoking them. The final agreement on June 10th represented a capitulation of the nationalists to Japanese demands on a grand scale. The withdrawal of all Kuomintang party organs and all nationalist military forces from Hebei province entirely, not just from the demilitarized zone. If we go back to the map, see a good nationalist map for the 1935 Hebei region. So versus the Tangguchu. So the Tangguchu is not a small region by any means. It's still this area, but let me see. This is the modern. This is the modern map for Hebei. I don't know if there's a better one. Well, let me actually maybe just put the land area. It's probably, maybe just put Hebei province area. Okay, so modern area might not be reflective of the old area, but it's 70,000 square miles or 188,000 square kilometers. If you look at the Tangguchu, I think it's probably much smaller than that. Maybe 2 or 3 times smaller at least. Hebei is huge. Shoot. Let me just search it up. I can do that here. No, I can't. Oh. Yeah, 5,000 square miles. That's insane. This is 14. So the military region which they're retreating from no longer allowed to be stationed in is 14 times larger. So it's a 14 times larger loss than last time. They're completely being chased. So this is not really good for Tokyo or Nanjing because, well, Nanjing is destabilized, and destabilized Nanjing means they're no longer able to give steady, um, concessions to the Japanese government because they are losing power themselves. And Tokyo, of course, doesn't want that. Nanjing, of course, hates that because they're just losing huge territories. Of course, the although the Umezu, I'm sorry, I don't speak Japanese, accord provided the Tianjin garrison army with a freer hand in Hebei. The Kuangtang army, not to be outdone, now pressed for increased control in Chahar province. And they keep going, right? This was a part of a scheme promoted by Colonel Doihara Kenji of the Mukden Special Service Organ to accelerate Japanese penetration of neighboring Inner Mongolia. So you see, like, these intelligence officers and these army men are making policy decisions on behalf of Japan once again. Accelerate Japanese penetration of neighboring Inner Mongolia, which was to be organized into an independent puppet state to be called Menguko, or Mengjiang, or it's spelled Mengjian, but it shouldn't be. It should be Mengjiang. But basically, another puppet government independent from Manchukuo or Manchukuo. So they want to set up another one of those guys. Less than 2 weeks after the Umezu arrangement, Doihara made his move, presenting the new provincial governor, I don't know, Qing Dechun, probably, with a whole range of demands designed to put an end to Nanjing's military and political presence in Chahar. With Kuangtang army units on his border without any sign of rescue from Nanjing, Qing folded and signed agreements with Doihara. So essentially, the nationalist military, also the Nationalist Party organ, which is essentially how the government organizes everything political, they are forced to retreat entirely from the region. And of course, the government without the military or the party has no choice but to accept all terms. His two agreements in 1935 drastically undermined the prestige of the nationalist government and worse weakened its government in North China. Conversely, the divide and rule arrangements had given Japan a dominant position in North China, particularly in Hebei and Chahar provinces. Encouraged by the ease with which they have forced agreement on a non-resisting nationalist regime, the Japanese field armies kept pushing along their provincial frontiers to pry them totally out of Nanjing's control. The various Japanese incursions of the humiliating accords after the humiliating accords in 1935 demonstrated to a widening circle of Chinese people that even acceptance of Manchukuo as an accomplished fact would not halt Japan's southward assault on China's borders. Such a realization contributed to the growing and ultimately explosive pressure for a change in Nanjing's policy towards Japan. This is hugely problematic because Chinese citizens can even see that this is not a rational, stable political actor who wants to negotiate with China for reasonable gains and will stop at those gains. This is a growing military power whose entire foreign policy is being dictated by military without any regard for political norms, and they just want to get more. So there's nothing to negotiate. So see, this policy doesn't really benefit Japan in the long term, but in the short term, it sure looks like it is doing wonders. Okay, so I'll stop here for today, and thanks for listening.